Welcome to SureCloud's webinar. We're going to focus today on changes in the compliance landscape, but particularly looking at PCI DSS and the future of your compliance program. So before we start, I'll just give a brief overview of who I am. So my name's Craig Moores. So I've worked at SureCloud for the last few years now. My primary responsibility is looking after the risk advisory delivery team. I'm an information security practitioner. I have been for a number of years, and I'm an experienced QSA as well. So the purpose of the session today is really to focus on three key objectives. So we want to have a little look at how compliance programs have evolved and what DSS compliance really means to an organization. Some of that may seem quite obvious, but obviously there are things there that underlie that some people often miss. We want to look at how organizations have adapted their approach to managing compliance and some of their key challenges. And we also then will take a brief look at version 4. I'm going to spoil it now. I'm not going to give away too much because it's obviously not been formally released yet. But we're going to look at some of the things that have been announced already that may benefit and hinder organizations and really have a look at how we can prepare for that. It's been obviously a number of years since PCI has released a new version, and I'm sure you're all hugely excited to see yet another version with some changes coming through as well. So I want to start really with what DSS compliance means to an organization. So as I've said there, it's quite unsurprising really that it's critical to any organization that accepts payment card transactions. I think that's fairly obvious. But it does have a number of underlying things that organizations obviously benefit from, but also recognize that PCI compliance gives them. So it provides some assurance of data security. So in this context, we're obviously looking at cardholder data. However, if you think about compliance programs more widely, they naturally appeal to all sorts of types of data security. If you're familiar with the high-level goals and the requirements within the DSS, then actually the controls that we're implementing and the assurance that we're looking at actually goes far wider. And it provides us, a defined baseline really against an industry standard. So, often organizations from a compliance perspective will have multiple requirements, particularly if they're operating in different jurisdictions, in different geographies. And it's really important that we do have that baseline to establish clear technical and governance structures. Organizations benefit from these types of activities because it gives them that reasonable level of assurance, but it also increases customer confidence. And, if you've been through the process of implementing the DSS or maintaining compliance with the DSS in any capacity, whether it be operational, tactical or strategic, that customer confidence is built really around the protection that we offer for customers and for their data. But it really strives to reduce the likelihood and your potential costs as well of a data breach. Ultimately, we're there to provide that assurance and of data security. But often things such as the DSS and the activities that we conduct to get to a position of compliance aren't really recognised until we have an incident or we have a data breach. So all of those things working together really, drive a mandatory requirement for organisations to continue to accept payment card transactions. So, it means different things for different organizations, whether your organization is there with a primary focus of achieving and maintaining compliance because you have to, whether you're doing it to, reduce the likelihood of a data breach, or whether you're using the DSS and its structure to really help focus where security governance and security controls are benefiting your security practice. There are a number of reasons why organizations obviously comply with the DSS outside of the fact of it being a mandatory requirement. So what does that actually look like? And I think it's really important for PCI to be put into context of how we actually use it. So I've tried to simplify that here with sort of 3 levels of a business management tier. And the compliance objectives that each of those tiers would be interested in. So if we start at the bottom up, because the majority of cardholder data management or compliance management would happen at the operational level, as we well know. And the operational stakeholders are there to deliver the day-to-day business activities. They're there to manage the operational environment, and that includes third parties. They're often considered to be the organizational SMEs, and they manage those compliance activities on that day-to-day basis. but they're obviously reporting those activities up to a tactical level. Compliance is not managed down in the day-to-day. It's not managed holistically at a level where we can create silos of good practice. So that obviously gets reported up to a tactical level where we're managing the implementation of those initiatives. And we're really trying to drive those against strategic goals and objectives. And that top level there is showing really that corporate compliance, the buy-in from management, that oversight, and the resources are obviously driven from a top-down approach in most effective compliance programs. But those objectives are not always reality. So in reality, we tend to look, if we look top-down, the strategic stakeholders could often expect ROI for compliance activities, therefore, look to potentially allocate the minimum required to maintain it. But when you're looking at this from a tactical level, you require that budget and resources really to make sure that you've got the right focus and right initiatives to implement and maintain compliance, regardless of what your benefits are for achieving and maintaining it. But it requires planning and execution to achieve and maintain as well. And often, I think we find at a tactical level that these things are seen as projects or point-in-time implementations. And it's important to note, really, that these are lasting life cycles of evolution. We're going through the process, and often it's referred back to kind of what used to be the PDCA life cycle within 27001. We're planning, we're doing, we're checking, we're then acting on it, and then we go back through that planning cycle. And you'll find that your operational environments are doing exactly the same thing. You're changing technologies, you're changing processes, you're bringing in new customers or new requirements, and ultimately that's going to change the way that you execute compliance activities. But down at the operational level, I think, is where reality probably differs to most companies. So there is obviously that responsibility for managing security requirements necessary to achieve and maintain PCI compliance. So whether you're looking sort of through requirements 1 and 2 around sort of physical builds and maintenance of firewalls, and through to sort of transmission or development activities, it requires resources really to support those payment channels that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. And it's really important that we sell that internally in the right way. And I'll come back to that in a little while. But we also now rely on a lot of third-party service providers. The concept of de-scoping your PCI environment, leaving yourselves kind of less to manage in terms of compliance obligations, requires a greater management of third parties and assurance really that there are quite well-defined RACI models so that roles and responsibilities are clearly defined. But I think the one thing that everybody needs to be aware of at the operational level is that these can be seen as tick box or one-off activities. And I guess that is the reality in the way that we approach compliance and the challenges that we're presented with as a business. And again, we'll come back to that in a minute. So if we group the two at the top there, you'd say that those are corporate governance, really. And those are looking very much at what the business needs to achieve, how the business needs to achieve that. And that feeds down really to this operational compliance that enables that to happen. And it's really important that we see that there's a synergy between the two. When we have business objectives that are not driving the right behaviors or potentially the right messaging around why managing compliance is really important, operational compliance can become out of sync with that. And you end up fighting for the same things, but in the wrong way. And I've highlighted a couple of those bits as we move through the next couple of slides to talk about really. So it's important that we make sure that compliance is joined together, primarily because PCI compliance requires all three of those to work together. Whether you're looking at the areas of compliance in terms of risk, whether you're looking at the reasons why you're doing PCI, which could potentially be in that corporate governance space, or the way that you're implementing PCI and managing the controls, probably more so down in the operational compliance area, PCI will have requirements that cover all of those things. Thinking, very briefly around managing technical controls, so particularly in sort of requirements 7, 8, and 10, or whether it be through, to scanning and validation that could feed out of corporate governance into operational compliance. But equally, I think the one that stands out often is requirement 12 around, some of the reasons and some of the process, some of the people elements of why we do PCI that tend to span all three of these areas. So where does that actually leave us? And I think that leaves us with conflicting objectives. We're looking very much from a business perspective at maintaining regulatory compliance. It's a requirement for us to do so. We're looking to do it to avoid breaches and fines. Ultimately, that is the goal of protecting any environment, is to keep that information safe. But we're doing it in a way that enables business growth and gives us the ability to attract new customers and ultimately to grow our business in a way that keeps information safe and secure. Which leaves us with sort of a number of issues. We have potential resourcing issues, we have prioritization issues. Compliance tends to be very reactive in a lot of organizations. So not only are we looking at that kind of proactive nature, but we're also looking at the reactive nature as well. And everything here will be a balance that's tied together with management buy-in. And management buy-in sits very much on both sides of the fence, and forgive my PowerPoint skills, but I couldn't get it to slide either way, because that conflicting objective is often driven by that management buy-in, whether it be positive, negative, or kind of in the middle, really. But everybody's got an interest to maintain compliance because we need to continue processing payments in order to ensure that our business model continues and for us to continue selling goods. But how do we trade off security in terms of avoiding breaches and fines against sort of resourcing and prioritizing activities? And I'm interested to hear whether any of you have had experience of this. So please feel free to submit any questions or comments through the chat window, because it'd be good to talk about those as we get a bit further in. But that leaves us really with what I'd call traditional problems with managing compliance, and these come from experience. So looking at the business, rapid growth or change can often lead to the need for that quick action. We need to onboard a new customer or new requirements. We need to bring in new technology. We need to drive forward a particular activity in order to enable the business. But sometimes that's not always with security or compliance coming alongside that. Which I'm sure you've all had experience of security activities being deprioritized on the basis of selling something different, or potentially driving different behaviors to ultimately achieve different goals, which comes back to those kind of conflicting objectives a little bit. But I often see compartmentalized compliance activities. As an organization, there are lots of different requirements for compliance, whether it be financial auditing, whether it be for internal audits against something like ISO 27001, whether it be for formal auditing against against PCI or any other standard, SOC 2, etc. The point being that we need to create this holistic compliance program where those activities are understood and shared, really, because if our business processes become disjointed across that operational environment, we end up operating in a way that has a lack of communication and ownership, really, and that tends to lead to achieving PCI or maintaining PCI in that very kind of isolated checkbox kind of approach. But compliance as a whole, often we have this broad cardholder data environment and the scope that can be based on a lack of understanding, particularly if we move rapidly or we grow quickly or we acquire other entities, it can become, very easy to just focus on technology. It's easy to see within the requirements of PCI that there is naturally a focus on how we secure the data in itself, looking through requirements 1 and 2 around, protecting our perimeter and looking at our ingress and egress controls, and then looking at how we build our technology in order to maintain a secure environment. It introduces you very quickly to technology being kind of one of the key areas. But for me, a lot of the issues in managing compliance, particularly with PCI, can come down to a lack of defined responsibilities. It's very quick to see how different requirements are managed by different teams across an organization, and those can often operate in silos to the point where going into a formal audit process, you're very much looking at different parts of the business in very different ways. But the key thing, I think, is hugely important to manage around these kind of traditional implementations is doing compliance for compliance sake. And I think PCI has always been very guilty of we do things for the sake of the way that the PCI DSS words something, the way that the standard focuses in a particular area. Picking up on a few examples, things like access controls are very specific in terms of what's required. Whereas, within most organizations, we have things that are aligned to industry best practice or to other industry standards. The key here is to balance compliance and make sure that we're not doing it just for the sake of ticking that box. We've had a question come in around fundamental changes. I don't think moving forwards there will be fundamental changes in how organizations will need to meet compliance. I think compliance will become more holistic. I think as we move through, you'll see in the next slide around some of the risks and things that we've seen over the last few years relating to remote working. I think people have looked at how to manage PCI compliance and ultimately how they're focused on obviously achieving and maintaining that as a robust baseline has changed. So I think it would be out of sort to change the way that people are managing compliance drastically. But I think aligning and allowing the DSS to become more flexible, which is potentially something that is coming within the new version, will enable people to actually have a more integrated or more developed compliance program that will enable them to achieve things without having this compliance for compliance sake. So a good question at this point. But I guess there's been complications and risks relating to remote working, and certainly these things have been experienced, from both sides of the table. A lot of the clients that I engage with, have struggled to adapt to remote working. Being businesses or organisations that are very focused on people-driven activities, whereby payment transactions and compliance with those are kind of maybe a smaller part of what they do. Ultimately adapting to remote working and how they actually manage compliance has thrown up a number of issues for them. And, I think the first one there is around the distributed workforce. Having people sat in an office where, people can have, discussion, where they can challenge things, where they can obviously get together more easily. Distributing that workforce can lead to miscommunication if your compliance program is not robust. And, I think that leads through to this kind of reduced centralization of control and compliance management. We're relying a lot on individuals maybe to keep the wheels turning and to make sure that reporting is done through the appropriate mechanisms. But I think we've all seen in the last sort of 18 months or so that we've put a lot of reliance on remote working technologies in order to continue managing things that would normally be done face to face, which does leave us with a potential lack of accountability. Compliance management, often now organizations will have centralized portals that have areas such as SharePoint or any other platform really where they can gather information centrally, where they can distribute responsibilities. But, with that distributed workforce and reliance on remote working technologies or email to keep that conversation going, I think can be very difficult to maintain good visibility of the compliance program. And look, let's not kid ourselves. The water cooler discussions that we have in an office are hugely important. Those little pieces of validation, those areas where we can get kind of quick help from colleagues. We see that increased visibility now in our calendars of those water cooler type discussions. And I think organisations have struggled to distill what benefit can be drawn out of those short meetings because they tend to overcrowd the calendar with things that maybe would be consumed with what we call day-to-day kind of office discussion. But I mean, that all looks very negative, and I think organizations have seen the benefits of those as well. Certainly from compliance activities, they can be less intrusive. We don't require people to be in particular places at particular times in order to carry out particular activities. So thinking about control inspections or auditing or areas where we would need to gather large groups of people together, the coordination of that can be quite difficult. So actually having something less intrusive where we're delivering things remotely can actually result in a greater efficiency. We can slot things into calendars a little bit sort of more straightforward. We can bring forward timelines on the basis of availability, and particularly if it's looking at auditing, we can improve the scheduling for compliance as well. So, we can use automated reminders for when things are due, thinking very much about scanning activities or for, risk reviews, firewall rule set reviews. We can actually slot those in a lot easier if we've got the ability to juggle those activities around within a virtual calendar. But I've found myself, that actually the demonstration of evidence via screen sharing, particularly in PCI assessments themselves has been a lot more straightforward. Often when we're on site and people are within a contained environment, answering questions around a cardholder data environment, showing you different activities. Actually, it can be quite difficult to gather that evidence on the fly, and people have to take away actions for requests for information. Actually, through screen share, we can use things like recording if that's acceptable. We can take screenshots as we're going through things. It's very easy to be able to gather that evidence and demonstrate that particular controls are in place. So I think there's a balance here really around complications and risks and how a business operates. Looking sort of forwards, I think organizations are becoming much more cloud-centric with a lot of organizations looking at how cloud technologies can benefit their general business model, but also with compliance that comes with kind of outsourcing with third parties and connectivity. Everything becomes potentially a little bit more straightforward. So remote working could be seen here as a negative thing, but I think on the balance of it, depending on how your business operates, it's really important to actually embrace those things that are working well and continue to do that. And that leads me in really to looking at how organizations are evolving compliance management, which is the crux really of what I wanted to talk about. If you look at that very traditional model that's people driven, the reliance on that operational, tactical and strategic organization, I think from my perspective, this kind of continuous control monitoring gives you a greater opportunity to be able to join up the various things that you do for managing compliance and ensure that you're not doing things for compliance sake. But that continuous control monitoring is also then tying in quite closely to automated testing. I'm sure if you're looking at moving to the cloud, the opportunity for new technologies or for applying different technologies that will automate a lot of the testing, monitoring and reporting that you would normally do quite manually, will result in less labor intensive activities. So, looking at those two things together, really leveraging technology to automate what is sensible to do so. I think the only thing to be cautious of there is ultimately how organizations are looking at that. I've seen a number of instances over the last year whereby, trying to achieve a greater level of automation has actually made life slightly harder because of the complexity of the logic that goes into what you're trying to get out of these automated patterns. So be careful and automate things that are necessary or that have an obvious improvement or time saving, but don't mistake the need for human intervention and making sure that you have the right balance of those two things when you're looking at the continuous control monitoring and leveraging that automated testing. I just noticed we had another question come in around the new version of PCI and whether it would better cater for cloud environments. And I think that's definitely a yes. I think through the request for comment processes that QSAs and participating organizations have been able to be a part of, one of the key things that's been noted all through those processes is that, the application of controls within the existing version of DSS, so version 3.2.1, they don't map directly into new cloud technologies and how organizations are adopting those kind of more fluid, more kind of automated processes. So I think we'll definitely see some changes in the requirements. I've got a few other things I've pulled out of the DSS a little bit further on, which I think will kind of build upon that as well. So I'll come back to that in a minute. I think building on those first 2 points, that the next one is around platform-based compliance. There's a lot of organizations now that are going for a single pane of glass compliance view. And that sits quite nicely on top of things like automated testing and monitoring, particularly if you can exchange information between systems for automated monitoring and reporting. You can then show those in the context of the wider compliance program. Organizations that leverage external tooling, particularly things like ASB scanning. Qualys, for example, has the ability to push information into lots of systems now and aggregate that data and give you quite nice trend analysis as to how your kind of cybersecurity posture is changing over time, whether you're introducing new vulnerabilities that can be correlated back to significant changes or changes in your compliance program. So it's really key to look at how we can simplify operational processes by using those things. And I think the evolution as we move forwards will be to continue leveraging these types of platforms that can automate that, such that you can get that single pane of glass view. You can look very quickly and see where you've got deficiencies. You can see where you've got things that are performing well and don't need enough process to actually govern them any further than the logic that you build out within them. But I think organizations should always target reductions in their compliance scope. Looking at new technologies, I went out not long ago to have a look at a new solution that would enable an organization to centrally manage its menus and to take payments and to process orders all through a device that can sit on the table with people that are dining. And I think when you're looking at the benefits of those, not only is that looking at leveraging sort of automation through a kind of centrally managed panel, you can also see exactly what's going on centrally. You can see, very granular levels of information, not only from the business processes, so the menu options you can customize and push out very quickly. Looking at how compliance works, when we're making little changes, we want to be able to cascade those effectively and make sure that that compliance scope is really kept to the minimum level possible, really. But that's not always the case. So as we move forwards, I think one of the things that we'll see more of is compliance by design. I think we've always been guilty of trying to over-engineer security into a process retrospectively. And I did allude to that earlier on, where some of the shortfalls in that very traditional model, moving very quickly, is that security isn't always considered from the beginning. And when we try to retrofit security into an existing process, it often creates more of a barrier than it does by designing it into that from the beginning. So I would urge you to think about compliance by design as you start to move forwards with new propositions or new processes or new activities, and really think about how you design compliance activities around that business. And for me, the key here is again, in an evolution in the DSS, and something that we'll come on to in a minute. I think looking at how we design business as usual to include PCI, particularly for activities that need to be repetitive, that need to be measured over that longer period of time. It's really important that we design those into the business as usual processes rather than trying to retrofit those. Now, that's not always possible. So I think having defined checkpoints where you go back and you have a look at your compliance program, you have a look at your business environment. I've got some kind of hints and tips, if you like, a bit further on as to how I think you prepare sort of for moving forwards, particularly with version 4 of the DSS, but also with how compliance activities evolve within your business as well. So maybe looking at version 4 now, it is expected to be released in Q1 2022. It does include a lot of added flexibility, which I think a lot of people, particularly the cloud question, having the ability to define your own customized validation routes to meet the intent of a security control. We're looking to lose that very prescriptive, thou shalt do it this way, and try and align that to more of what you do in other parts of the business, because that will reduce that opportunity for doing compliance for compliance sake. We are expecting some new requirements. Naturally, with a new version of the standard, there are new technology since the last version has been released, but potentially those will become more stringent. We may expect for different frequencies in measuring compliance. The council, along with acquirers and card brands, has done a lot of work around breaches and looking at the trends around root cause analysis for those. And there's been quite a key response to that within the standard. But a lot of the terminology and clarifications, I think we can expect to be updated as well. Certainly in the RFC, there's a lot of terminology that appears to have changed. And I think that will allow organizations to align their compliance with kind of more of the activities that they conduct across other areas of their business as well. And naturally, we're going to see some best practice updates, particularly around authentication and password guidance. I alluded to it earlier, but I think a lot of organizations struggle with particularly the more advanced solutions they've got around privileged access management or around role-based access controls. The authentication controls can be a little bit out of date within the DSS in how you apply them to an operational environment. And that also comes with updated password guidance as well. But it will continue to promote security as a continuous process. So thinking back to what we were talking about a minute ago, where we were looking at compliance by design, I think that will come through very much in the new version of the standard, and looking at continuing to embed these processes within within an organization's business as usual activities. And that will be tied in quite closely with meaningful risk assessments. One of the things that I think has often been criticised about the DSS, particularly with clients over the years as the DSS has evolved, is that it doesn't carry very much in terms of risk management. It's very prescriptive in terms of the controls that are expected and the level that they're expected to be implemented to in order to be considered in place. So actually having the ability to define, and have customized validation paths, with this kind of coupled with this meaningful risk assessment approach, I think will give, a lot of control back to an organization to demonstrate how they're meeting the intent of a security control, rather than actually doing, the implementation of these for the sake of it. And I think the last point there around the wider applicability for encryption on trusted networks, I think version 4 will be received in different ways. I think we can look at version 4 in a very positive way. But I think we've also got a number of comments that we're seeing in the industry around kind of what that will bring. And I wanted to share a few of those with you now. So from my perspective, I think version 4 will be very positive. I think the industry varies, and I've seen a lot of different comments around it, particularly in the last 6 to 8 months or so. Looking at those customized validations, I think it'll make it easier to demonstrate how an organization complies with security objectives. And the purpose being that they're going to be doing things for the right reason and not because PCI says so. And I think that's called out in the middle here, where it says, PCI compliance has started to become less tick box. There's a lot of frequencies built into the way that we manage and implement compliance. I think it's really important that version 4 takes that a step further. But you can see here that there's some also balance of those things, some perception that version 4 won't affect the payment channels. Now, I think every payment channel will be affected by version 4 and the changes that come within it. So it's really important that you do consider version 4 to be a necessary evil, as described down the bottom there. But I think, again, it takes a long time to get compliant in some areas. Organizations have a lot of challenges around the way that legacy equipment works, the way, that they're migrating things into the cloud. So actually changing the standard again, might actually sort of have a drawback there. But I think recent changes in the threat landscape, and I agree with this, I think it gives people more comfort that they're protecting against breaches. And I'm hoping that version 4 will actually start to give that more risk-based approach that will align better with other areas of compliance, so that when we as QSAs come into an organization, we can see naturally that something is there for a purpose and that it's aligned to other activities that we're carrying out. But also, the need for QSAs to engage more with their clients and help to design those appropriate controls, I think is hugely valuable. I think there's a lot of different interpretations of how the different control requirements can be implemented. I think it will obviously benefit organizations to work a lot closer with their QSA if that's necessary, to be able to understand what's expected. And really to drive forward that control monitoring, I can see a greater level of integration with version 4, which will allow for those inspections to be carried out more easily. And I think that's really important when we're considering how our compliance program as a whole needs to evolve. Considering some of these areas, both positively and negatively, I think leaves a number of key considerations for me. And there will be new challenges. We need to keep abreast of the threat landscape. Certainly within the last 18 months or so, I think we've seen an increase in particular types of threat actor activity, particularly around phishing and around kind of spoofing. So obviously, with organizations having to shut physical locations, so those bricks and mortar channels for a longer period of time and move to e-commerce environments, actually understanding new technologies, particularly around mobile devices and data management and how those can benefit the organization, I think is hugely important. But we need to make sure that we evolve the compliance program to accommodate those as well. We need to make sure that we've got a very integrated, very holistic, a very straightforward approach to managing compliance, because it doesn't need to be complicated. However, I think that's going to bring some opportunities. I think it gives us the opportunity to increase awareness, particularly with data risks. Obviously, those risks are changing as the threat landscape changes, as our technology changes. We need to have a better understanding of our business operations and make sure that those objectives that we talked about earlier on are more aligned, and that they obviously, that we're all moving in the same direction. And I think if we achieve that, then we get a more efficient approach to executing business processes. We think about leveraging automation, we think about continuous control monitoring. Those are going to reduce our need for human intervention in some areas, which will create efficiencies in itself. But it will also ensure that our security controls are embedded, and that we form a more effective business culture, which, if you go right back to the beginning of what we set out to achieve, I think every organization will do these for a number of reasons. And for me, I think that the biggest thing here that underpins this is how we evolve our business culture in order to make sure that we're protecting cardholder data for the right reasons. And our compliance program is absolutely key to that. So whether we're embracing new technologies, whether we're embracing areas where we need to improve or make our business processes more efficient or more effective, the goal being that gives us an opportunity to be able to do that, and to be able to embed that at a level that is operational. So I want to just leave you, I guess, with some preparation for the future. And it's not always good to prepare for the unknown until it's released, but I think there are some really fundamental things that organizations can do. And PCI DSS version 4 will come with a transition period where organizations can still obviously continue with the program that they have against 3.2.1 and be able to still comply with that and be assessed against that. However, I think all of these require you to set the right foundations. And the fundamental thing there is ensuring the scope of the CDE is accurate. The business changes very frequently, and often we can miss things that can impact on the cardholder data environment. If you look in the more recent versions of the standard, and more recent being kind of 3.1, 3.2, and 3.2.1, actually looking at significant changes that can impact on the scope. Hopefully your organization's considered how those impacts can affect the scope of compliance, but often they can be missed. So it's really important that you ensure the scope of your CD is accurate, because then as you could kind of move through this, you can actually look at how those changes are going to affect what you do and how you do it. But you can't do that unless you keep abreast of the changes, and make sure you review the new version of the DSS when it's available. Now, you can either do that on your own, or you can do it with your QSA, or just with an independent party, really. But the key for me is to increase the awareness of those compliance changes with business stakeholders. There is going to be a journey attached to this. It would be very unlikely that organizations will be able to switch from assessing against version 3.2.1 to version 4 overnight. There's going to be a period of transition as they move through. And there is a question again around version 4 and where you can get a copy. So I'm going to guess that there'll be a lot of noise when version 4 does go live in January or February next year. But the goal being, if you're a participating organization, you should have had the opportunity to have access to the request for comment versions. The SSC is actually maintaining a blog at the moment of summary of the changes and the expected kind of timelines and things. So if you're interested in that, then do Google it. It's on their blog. Otherwise, I'm quite happy to share the link with you. My details are at the end, so feel free to drop me an email, and I'll quite happily share a bit more information with you. But I personally don't think, in response to the next question there around version 4, I don't think it will make it more complicated to maintain compliance. And I'm not seeing a great deal of that with clients that I'm engaging with and my team is engaging with. But I think always when there's something unknown, it can be very quick and easy to assess that as being something that adds to the complications of compliance management, be it that transition period, be it the adoption or implementation of new controls. But ultimately, for me, it's about how we manage that. And if your compliance program is set up in a way that is going to enable you to consume that, the transition period actually shouldn't be all that complicated. The controls are actually going to make life easier, in my view, particularly if you're doing things for the sake of PCI requiring them. You're actually now going to be able to use other things that you do and be able to actually demonstrate compliance in a more holistic and more integrated fashion. But you are going to need to update your compliance program. And I think you should assess the impact of any changes in version 4 requirements that affect your CDE. Because ultimately that is what's most important. How are you going to get from where you are to where you're going to be? So having said that, before we move on to any final questions, I did miss sort of dropping the poll. So I'm going to drop it now for you. I'm interested whether you've made any significant changes to your compliance program in the last few years. I'm seeing a real kind of mixed response to this as we talk to prospects and to clients, and I'll be really interested to see whether you're making significant changes. So whether you're adapting the standards that you're complying with, whether you're seeing new requirements come in, particularly around UK SOX or SOC, or any other standard that you're going to need to comply with, because I think what you've learned through that process is ultimately going to help you to transition version, towards version 4 and the new requirements and potentially the new validation routes that you're going to have an opportunity to adopt as you move forwards. So I want to leave you with that, but also give the opportunity to ask any questions. Obviously, we've had some questions as we've gone through. Has anybody else got any questions at this point? Yeah, it's a good question. Tips around ensuring the CD is accurate. I think I always look at this like an onion skin approach. So I always look at the outside inwards. So it's really important that we understand our cardholder data flows as the starting point. So if you do anything first, I would suggest you walk through the customer journey and actually walk through in their shoes and have a look at ultimately, where does payment card data go? How does it transition through your infrastructure? If it does indeed, how are we actually testing compliance at the moment? Are we going through an SAQ route? Are we going through a ROC route? Are we merchant? Are we service provider? And I'd take that context and I'd actually look at making sure that things are still accurate. Are the technologies that we consider to be in scope when we define those data flows, are they still there? Is cardholder data still taking the same route through our environment? Have we brought any other additional systems into scope by potentially making some changes to the activities that we do or the network connectivity? Are we opening ourselves up through new environments that we're connecting into the CDE without potentially having assessed the impact of those? So I think hints and tips: start with the cardholder data flows, start with the customer journey, and then think about this from an onion skin approach. So everything with PCI for me is about layers. You'll start at an external layer where cardholder data will come into potentially a demilitarized zone. It will come through kind of some web servers. It will come through your sort of perimeter gateways or firewalls. It will then make its way through potentially a web or an application tier down into a data tier. It may then sort of have connected systems there that are obviously important for maintaining the security of the environment, and peel back those edges and make sure that for each layer you can track the cardholder data through your environment and make sure that you obviously understand where it's going, why it's going there. And I think that's a really good starting point to ensure that your CDE is accurate. Maintaining that accuracy, I think, is about building in those kind of regular checks and validations as you go through business as usual activities. And typically the sticking points for me are software development life cycles, particularly as we're moving now more to cloud deployments and infrastructure as code. It's very easy to include sort of new areas of a cloud environment with very minimal change. But we want to make sure that we've got some of the fundamental things right. Let's make sure that we've locked things down to the relevant levels with IAM profiles or through role-based access controls. And I think actually maintaining that accuracy is a combination of lots of different internal processes. So doing the basics right for me is really, really important. Make sure you've got regular checkpoints. Make sure that you are maintaining the frequency of things such as firewall rule set reviews. Really good starting points for seeing where you're introducing scope creep to your CDE. But I don't think there's a silver bullet for any of this. I think you need to consider how you're reviewing that on an ongoing basis. Think about your processes for change management and identifying and managing significant changes. Things like your regular vulnerability scanning, making sure that you're not seeing new assets appearing in those scopes that are not that are unknown or are not contributing to parts of your cardholder data environment. It's very quick for those types of things to increase the scope of the CDE, and that can obviously increase the potential attack landscape for a third party or internal malicious insiders as well. So think very carefully about how you embed that kind of check process. But it's really good to start with the cardholder data journey and that kind of onion skin view of the environment as well. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so I guess it's just an opportunity to thank you for your time. I hope you found content interesting. If you do have any questions, feel free to come to me directly or get in touch with any of my colleagues with the SureCloud links on the left there. Just to sort of give you a heads up on a couple of upcoming webinars. So I'll be presenting again later this month around sort of practical steps to embedding and measuring compliance. And I also host SureCloud cyber threat briefing. And our next one there is on the 14th of December. So we'll be talking all things kind of cyber threats and attackers as well. Yeah, good question around the recording. Yeah, that will be made available to you as well. So thank you for your time. If you do have any questions, please feel free to come back to me. Otherwise, have a great afternoon and thank you for your time.